Everyone, my name is Pat Armstrong and I co-chair the Equity Committee at the CAUT. I want to make you all aware that there's simultaneous translation, and unless you work equally well in French and English, I suggest that you click on to the little globe at the bottom for interpretation and click on to the language of your choice. And to start, I want to begin with our territorial acknowledgement. I'd like to take this moment to remind you that although the meeting is virtual, we all do our work on specific Indigenous territories. Some of these territories are governed by treaties, but some are still unceded. I would ask that you reflect on the conditions under which we occupy these spaces today and always. 26 years ago, Rosalie Abella was appointed by the federal government to, quote, inquire into the most efficient, effective, and equitable means of promoting employment opportunities and eliminating systemic discrimination against 4 designated groups: women, Native people, disabled persons, and visible minorities, end of quote. Today, of course, we would say equity-seeking groups, inclusive of women, Indigenous people, racialized minorities, persons with disabilities, and LGBTQ+. 25 years ago, today, the current Employment Equity Act was passed, and just recently, government announced plans to modernize the Act. 3 speakers today bring their ideas on the legacy of the Employment Equity Act and where we need to go from here and how we should take up this new opportunity. I just want to tell you that the presentations will be followed by question and answer, with each speaker taking 10 minutes, I hope, to present. And then, of course, I'll just cut them off. And although we will have other opportunities in the question and action session, so you can ask your question in the chat function. The session will be recorded, just so you know, and it will be available for later viewing. And if you have any technical concerns, please message host in the chat. I would like to introduce the 3 speakers. I think I will introduce all 3 of them at once, and it's suggested to me that you can read about them in the announcement and that I should just provide you with a brief description of why we have these important people here today to speak with us. Carol Agócs has a PhD and is a professor emerita at the Department of Political Science at Western University in London, and her research and publications address issues of racial and gender inequality and discrimination in employment and employment equity policy and its implementation. Her publications include Employment Equity in Canada, The Legacy of the Abella Report, and Workplace Equality, International Perspectives on Legislation, Policy, and Practice. Larry Rousseau is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. Previously, he served in leadership roles with the Public Service Alliance of Canada. His public service career was at Statistics Canada. He has a certificate in civil law from the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, Civil Law section, and a master's degree in public administration from the École nationale d'administration publique in Quebec. Malinda Smith is a political science professor and the inaugural Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. She's a former Vice President, Equity Issues for the Federation of the Humanities and Social Science, and currently serves as chair of its Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization. She serves on the Statistics Canada Working Group on Black Communities in Canada, the Canada Research Chair's Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Policy, and the Interinstitutional Advisory Committee for National Dialogues and Action for Inclusive Higher Education and Committee. And in her spare time, she speaks on Zoom. Anyway, thank you, and we will go first to Carol.
Thanks, Pat, for your introduction, and thanks to Pam Foster and to Marcel Roy for organizing this panel for CAUT, and to all of you for being with us today to talk about Canada's Employment Equity Act. Today's climate of activism on issues of systemic racism, sexism, and disability, on the need for action on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and on recognition of LGBTQ identities, reminds me of the political climate in Canada in the mid-1980s, when the Abella Report was commissioned and published. Judge Rosalie Silberman Abella, now the Supreme Court of Canada Justice, was the sole author of the report on the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment, published in 1984, at a time of grassroots activism and hope that progress toward social justice was possible. Her mandate and the focus of her report was to inquire into systemic discrimination in employment and its impacts on 4 groups, then referred to as women, visible minorities, Aboriginal people, and persons with disabilities. Shepherded by Flora MacDonald, Minister of Employment and Immigration, the Employment Equity Act was passed in 1986 by the Mulroney government, and it took effect in 1987. The 1995 Employment Equity Act replaced the 1986 Act, amended it, and covered the federal public service, the Canadian Forces, and the RCMP under the Act's purview. The 1995 Act both strengthened and weakened elements of the 1986's Act enforcement regime. In reflecting on her work on the Royal Commission report, Abella noted that understanding the meaning of equality was of central importance. She concluded that respect for differences allows people to be treated as equals. Ignoring differences creates inequality. And that proposition remains the key to understanding what is involved in implementing the Employment Equity Act. The 1986 Act met with a mixed reception. While some equality seekers and human rights advocates celebrated its potential to remove systemic barriers to economic and employment opportunity for women, racialized communities, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous peoples, others pointed to its flaws and limitations. The Employment Equity Act was proactive in that it was intended to prevent discrimination rather than to deal with discrimination after it occurred, like human rights process does. It addressed systemic patterns, not just individual complaints of discrimination. It was mandatory for employers in the federal jurisdiction, and it was distinctly Canadian rather than a copy of affirmative action policy in the United States. However, the Employment Equity Act was limited in scope, restricted to a specific set of requirements for employers. Judge Abella's report, it called attention to the need for a variety of institutional changes and supports to make equality of employment opportunity a reality. These changes and supports are beyond the scope of a federal law about equity in the workplace, but they are needed to address systemic discrimination more broadly. We're still waiting for the national public childcare system, her report advocated, and there remain weaknesses in systems for evaluating foreign credentials and work experience. Indigenous communities continue to lack the educational opportunities and healthy living conditions required to support successful employment. Despite specific legislation addressing accommodation for persons with disabilities, they continue to face workplace barriers and lack of employment opportunities. The provinces, whose laws cover the vast majority of Canadian workers, have yet to enact and retain employment equity legislation. Ontario adopted a leading-edge employment equity law in the early 1990s under Bob Rae's NDP government, but it was repealed as one of the first acts of the Harris Conservative government in 1995. Today, less than 13% of Canada's workforce is covered by employment equity requirements in the federal jurisdiction. The Act is also limited by other weaknesses. Since its origin, the Act's enforcement and sanctions for non-compliance with requirements have been ineffective. Employers face fines for failing to file accurate annual reports with the government, but no sanctions for failing to develop and implement employment equity plans and goals. Collecting and reporting data on employers' workforce has too often become a numbers game with little impact on real change toward greater equity in the workplace. Some employers are taking employment equity seriously and showing sustained commitment and improvements. However, others have been seduced by competing narratives about voluntary diversity and inclusion strategies that enhance corporate images without making corporations accountable for taking action to reduce systemic barriers and demonstrate gains in equity for their employees. Without legal consequences, employers may find it easy to let employment equity take a back seat to other priorities. A number of inherent and other weaknesses have limited the Employment Equity Act's effectiveness in getting the results it was meant to achieve. There's been a gap between policy and practice, between the theory and Abella's policy vision for employment equity as a remedy for systemic discrimination in the workplace, and the reality that many employers tend to do the minimum required to comply with the Act. Employers are implementing the Act as written, not the policy of employment equity as envisioned by Abella. It has been 33 years since the original Employment Equity Act came into force. There's research evidence that despite its weaknesses, the Act has left a significant legacy and accomplished much. Data reported by employers covered by the legislated Employment Equity Program has shown gains in the representation of women and members of racialized groups in the private and public sectors, and Indigenous people in the public sector. Women have made notable gains in access and career development under employment equity, though all 4 equity groups are still underrepresented in leadership positions. Research in 2010 comparing large firms covered by the LEAP program and the Federal Contractors Program, comparing them with Financial Post 500 companies that were not covered by those programs, found a greater number of diversity management practices in the LEAP firms, followed by the FCP firms as compared with the other Fortune 500 companies. Differences were significant on recruitment, training and development, and accountability for employment equity goals. The researchers, Eddie Nigg and Ron Burke, concluded that, and I quote, "Employment equity legislation remains the most effective tool at promoting equity and diversity in Canadian organizations," end quote. Today's workplace is quite different from the one that the 1986 or the 1995 Employment Equity Act was designed for. A growing proportion of jobs are non-standard and precarious. Many do not offer careers, security, or coverage by benefits plans or even employment standards. Fewer private sector workplaces are covered by collective agreements. Employees must look out for their own employment future on their own. But a growing proportion are working in jobs for which they are overqualified or working part-time and voluntarily or are unemployed. Many face discriminatory barriers because they're immigrants or Indigenous or members of racialized groups. COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerability of essential service workers, predominantly members of racialized groups and women who have been overrepresented among those who have contracted the virus and those who have died because of their work with ill or elderly patients and their overcrowded working and living conditions. Their plight should surely alert Canadians and our government to the need for more equitable working conditions for those we depend on to care for all of us and for every Canadian. 33 years after the first Employment Equity Act came into force, as part of its fall economic update, the Government of Canada announced funding to support a task force on modernizing the Employment Equity Act and additional funds to expand the Workplace Opportunities and Barriers to Equity program and to support anti-racism initiatives and Black-owned businesses. These announcements engender hope. The Act has not been reviewed since 2002, although the Act prescribes a legislative review every 5 years. Changes to regulations by the Harper government weakened the Federal Contractors Program, and its omnibus budget bill reduced funding to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which is responsible for compliance reviews and enforcement for the legislated Employment Equity Program. At times in the past, government reviews of the Act or its regulations have delivered bad news to equality seekers. However, in the best case scenario, the newly announced task force to modernize the Employment Equity Act might address some of the weaknesses built into the Act and recommend adequate funding to support the proper implementation by employers and the auditing and enforcement functions of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. My vision for a stronger Employment Equity Act would include the following changes. First, following meaningful consultations with representatives of the equity-seeking groups, update the language used to refer to them in the Act. The term visible minorities is not acceptable, and the term Aboriginal peoples should be supplanted by Indigenous peoples. Second, broaden the coverage of the Act to include the LGBTQ and two-spirited population as an equity-seeking group. 3, amend the regulations under the Act to require collection, analysis, and reporting of employers' data to recognize the reality of intersectionality or multiple identities of individuals. This would allow, for example, analysis of gender inequality within the racialized Indigenous and disabled populations, as well as inequality on the basis of racial group, indigeneity, and disability within the population of women. 4, strengthen the Act to require employers covered by the legislated employment equity program to demonstrate that they actually implement their employment equity plans and attain the goals they have set in order to close the gap between representation of the equity-seeking groups in their workplace and in the labor market. Institute robust penalties for failure to implement employment equity, not just for failure to report their numbers. 5, increase the coverage of the federal contractors program by lowering the $1 million contract threshold, perhaps to $50,000 as in the US, and by lowering the size threshold from 100 employees to perhaps 50. Improve contractors' accountability by requiring them to publicly report on their employment equity systems reviews and their employment equity plans, goals, and results on a regular basis. 6, require both LEAP and FCP employers to consult meaningfully with their unions and to establish employment equity committees comprised of representatives of the equity-seeking groups, as well as corporate leaders, union reps, and human resources specialists. These committees should play leading roles in implementing the required employment systems review and in scrutinizing the employer's employment equity plans, goals, and implementation efforts while retaining the corporate executive's responsibility. And finally, 7, provide for continuing budgetary support for the auditing and enforcement roles of the Canadian Human Rights Commission and Employment Equity Tribunal, as well as for the labor program or other entity that provides ongoing consultation and support to employers, unions, equity-seeking groups, and other stakeholders involved in implementing employment equity requirements.
Thank you very much, Carol.
I'm out of time.
What a comprehensive take on the report and the 2 equity legislations and what happens. Whew, that's quite a tour de force. Now, Larry, you get to pick up where and follow that.
Merci. Thank you very much. And I'm going to speak in French. Of course. So, alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci de me recevoir. Merci Pat et merci aux personnes qui ont organisé cet événement. Comme a été dit, il y a 35 ans que la loi sur l'équité en matière d'emploi a été adoptée. Près de 20 ans se sont écoulés depuis son examen législatif majeur, le plus récent. Alors, pourtant, nos lieux de travail ne sont pas encore le reflet de la diversité de la population canadienne. Le CTC a bien accueilli favorablement l'engagement qui a été pris par le gouvernement fédéral dans son énoncé public, son énoncé économique cet automne, de créer un groupe de travail sur la modernisation de la loi. Les syndicats du Canada demandent un examen de cette loi depuis longtemps, car ils reconnaissent que les progrès ont été extrêmement lents. Il y a nettement lieu d'en faire davantage pour niveler les obstacles systémiques qui empêchent les femmes et les personnes autochtones, noires et racialisées et ayant un handicap d'accéder aux emplois et de gravir les échelons dans le champ de compétences fédérales. La dernière fois que qu'il a été question de réviser la loi, c'est quand Stockwell Day et Jason Kenney ont annoncé l'intention, et l'intention, dis-je bien, du gouvernement conservateur d'examiner l'équité en emploi dans la fonction publique fédérale. Mais la révision demandée n'a jamais eu lieu et le gouvernement conservateur a continué à piétiner en matière d'équité dans les pratiques d'emploi fédéral. Voici des questions dont nous aimerions traiter. La loi devrait permettre de tenir compte des groupes qui font l'objet de discrimination systémique, mais qui ne sont pas assujettis à la loi actuelle. Les LGBTABI deviendront-ils le 5e groupe désigné? L'usage du terme minorité visible a été très critiqué parce qu'en regroupant bon nombre de groupes très différents, il cache les formes distinctes de racisme et de discrimination dont font l'objet les personnes noires ou les personnes, par exemple, musulmanes ou sikhs, par exemple, en raison de leurs pratiques religieuses ou de leur tenue vestimentaire, etc. Faut-il tenir compte aussi des travailleurs et travailleuses les plus vieux, les jeunes, de ceux qui assument des responsabilités de prestation de soins ou de ceux d'autres catégories? Nous devrons examiner non seulement la représentation des membres de groupes recherchant l'équité dans l'ensemble des lieux de travail, mais aussi les lieux où ils travaillent, les emplois qu'ils occupent et leur représentation à différents niveaux au sein des effectifs. Ont-ils accès à des promotions? Ont-ils des possibilités de se perfectionner et d'avancer dans leur carrière? Quelles sont les mesures qui ont été prises pour changer les choses? Lesquelles de ces mesures-là sont efficaces? La loi aura-t-elle le mordant nécessaire pour que les objectifs d'équité en matière d'emploi soient atteints? Quelles mesures doivent être prises, par exemple, pour exiger et obtenir la reddition de comptes? Comment pouvons-nous mieux intégrer l'intersectionnalité à l'évaluation du succès de la loi? La loi permettra-t-elle de recueillir et d'utiliser à des fins administratives des données dûment subdivisées afin de mieux comprendre les obstacles qui risquent de continuer à poser des problèmes aux groupes recherchant l'équité? La nouvelle édition de la loi comparera-t-elle les résultats des différentes parties du programme, la fonction publique, le secteur privé et le programme de contrats fédéraux? Quel soutien et ressources pourraient être établis pour encourager des progrès valables et provoquer le changement culturel nécessaire afin de créer des lieux de travail vraiment inclusifs? Nous entendons souvent les gestionnaires parler de diversité et d'inclusion. Cela devient une des principales valeurs de l'organisation. Il y a une industrie vraiment entière de spécialistes et de consultants à ce sujet qui croient à pas de géant. Je ne doute pas des bonnes intentions des employeurs qui veulent faire savoir qu'ils sont favorables à la diversification de la main-d'œuvre. Mais l'avantage d'une loi proactive est qu'elle exige de prendre des mesures et d'obtenir des résultats, pas simplement de porter des belles paroles à son site web. La responsabilité et l'imputabilité d'une application concrète des principes et des actions d'équité en matière d'emploi manquent carrément. En somme, nous reconnaissons que l'équité en matière d'emploi n'est pas un passe-partout dans la recherche de l'élimination des obstacles systémiques. Ce n'est qu'un des outils que nous aurons dans notre coffre d'outils. Pour vraiment changer les choses, nous devons régler des questions telles que l'absence de services de garde à l'enfance et les autres soins universels, l'accès à la formation et à l'éducation, la violence et l'harcèlement au travail, le manque d'accès au soutien et traitement en santé mentale et de très nombreuses autres. Bien sûr, c'est pour cela que les syndicats agissent et que les droits de la personne sont au cœur d'une si grande partie de leurs efforts. Nous devons donner la priorité aux droits de la personne et à l'équité plus que jamais. Un regard sur 2 décennies d'équité en matière d'emploi de 1987 à 2009 porte à croire qu'elle n'a pas été uniformément efficace pour les 4 groupes désignés. La population autochtone est censée continuer à croître et elle constituera une importante source de main-d'œuvre pour le Canada. Toutefois, les Autochtones continuent à se heurter à des obstacles à leur participation à la population active. Les personnes ayant un handicap continuent de se heurter à des obstacles très semblables car elles sont sous-représentées en milieu de travail et il arrive souvent qu'ils soient concentrés dans des emplois au bas de l'échelle et à temps partiel. C'est pour cela que les décideurs devraient assurer une meilleure mise en application de l'équité en matière d'emploi, car les employeurs n'hésitent pas à invoquer des exigences professionnelles justifiées et des contraintes excessives pour refuser de prendre des mesures d'adaptation aux besoins des travailleurs et travailleuses ayant un handicap. On estime que ce sont les femmes et les membres de minorités visibles, alors les personnes racialisées et de race noire, qui illustrent certains succès de l'équité en matière d'emploi et leurs tendances en matière d'emploi se ressemblent beaucoup. Leurs taux de représentation suivent de très près leur disponibilité sur le marché du travail, sauf dans le cas des femmes ces dernières années, et leur représentation est proportionnelle dans des emplois professionnels et de gestion. Toutefois, il y a des plafonds de verre dans le cas des minorités visibles et des femmes au niveau supérieur de la direction. Elles sont démesurément employées et ghettoisées si les conditions sont égales par ailleurs. Bien que l'équité en matière d'emploi ait été partiellement efficace, il y a lieu de s'efforcer davantage de rompre le plafond de verre et de permettre aux membres de minorités visibles et aux femmes d'entrer sur un pied d'égalité dans la chasse gardée des hommes blancs. Une des mesures prises à cet effet est la politique québécoise sur le service de garde d'enfants et les congés parentaux universels. La loi a été adoptée pour niveler les obstacles en milieu de travail afin que personne ne se voit privé de possibilités d'emploi pour des raisons n'ayant pas trait à ses compétences. L'équité en matière d'emploi exige que les organisations prennent des mesures proactives, c'est-à-dire des mesures spéciales, et adoptent des politiques et des pratiques positives pour assurer aux membres des groupes désignés une représentation proportionnelle au travail. C'est pour cela que les employeurs sont tenus de prendre des mesures proactives pour éliminer les obstacles à l'emploi et voir à ce que les groupes désignés soient proportionnellement représentés et repartis au sein de leurs effectifs. Combien de cas de non-conformité ont été renvoyés au tribunal canadien des droits de la personne et à mon humble avis, les interventions dans l'ensemble n'ont pas été efficaces. Un des principaux indicateurs du succès de l'équité en matière d'emploi au Canada est l'atteinte d'une représentation proportionnelle des membres des groupes désignés par rapport à leur taux de disponibilité sur le marché du travail. C'est sur ce fond que l'étude en cours examine l'efficacité de l'équité en matière d'emploi au Canada à la lumière des données des rapports annuels publiés selon la loi. Au début de la mise en place du programme d'équité en matière d'emploi en 1987, les agences centrales, le Conseil du Trésor et la Commission de la fonction publique, et j'étais là, avaient la responsabilité directe d'assurer la mise en œuvre du programme. Chaque ministère avait un ou des agents de programme d'équité en matière d'emploi chargés de la mise en place et de l'application des plans pour assurer la représentation des groupes cibles et notamment des campagnes de déclaration volontaire, self-identification, étaient en place dans plusieurs ministères. Les agents de programme faisaient rapport aux agences centrales qui gardaient les ministères imputables. En 1997, avec la mise en place de la nouvelle loi, les agences centrales ont délégué aux ministères et agences, notamment aux directeurs de département, la responsabilité du programme. Sans une direction centralisée, les ministères ont pataugé dans une dynamique d'application non uniformisée des normes établies par la législation. Le coup de grâce a été assaini en 2004 par la loi sur la modernisation de la fonction publique. Et je termine. Cette nouvelle législation avait pour but de décentraliser encore plus le processus de sélection du personnel dans les ministères. Notamment, le principe du mérite devait faire place au principe du best fit, où la personne la mieux adaptée pour être nommée au poste selon le jugement souvent subjectif du ou de la gestionnaire qui embauchait. Avec l'arrivée quelques années plus tard d'un gouvernement qui n'avait aucunement l'intention ni de rectifier le tir, ni d'appliquer la lettre et l'esprit de la loi, nous avons la situation que nous avons aujourd'hui. Une loi et un programme d'équité en matière d'emploi désuet, inefficace et sans issue. Passons maintenant à l'action. Merci.
Excellent, Larry, and excellent timing. And you've certainly raised important questions about groups that are missing and figuring out how do we include them in this process. Malinda.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. And I too would like to thank COUT, and particularly Pam and myself for the invitation and for facilitating this, and you, Pat, for moderating the session. I want to make 4 points, focusing primarily on the federal contractors program and the implications for Canadian universities, colleges, and CJEP. So as has been noted in the previous presentations, the federal contractors program was the route by which universities, colleges, CJEPs entered into much of this conversation. And so I want to just simply say that here we are, we just passed the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. We are now marking the 25th anniversary of the second iteration of the Employment Equity Act. We are in the 5th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its 94 calls to actions with regard to Indigenous peoples, including the role of post-secondary sector. And yet we have very weak, in my view, employment equity and EDI infrastructures in Canadian universities. And I want to stress the word infrastructure, because that was actually fundamental to that's not the language that was used in the federal contractors program, but that's actually what they were calling for, with the call for senior leadership, with the call for data collection and accountability mechanisms. So this is 2020, and we have, most institutions do not have this infrastructure, except for, and this is an important caveat, except for the research ecosystem, where such infrastructure comes in for the Canada Research Chairs programs, or the CERCS program, or the new kind of frontiers in research for new scholars. And that's actually, I want to hold on to that thought. So what I want to say then is, the second point I want to make then is that as soon as the federal contractors programs were introduced into Canadian universities, many of the universities themselves shifted the infrastructure from 4 equity-seeking groups to 1. So, and that is, we focus on the status of women. I actually think that was informed by the earlier work on the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. But the second thing was informed by was there was actually a women's movement that actually pushed accountability for those of us women who were in the academy, women's studies programs. We had a community check on our activities. So the accountability wasn't institutional, it was actually the infrastructure of the women's movement outside the university. But universities did not develop a racial equity program, and most still don't have one. They have no anti-racism initiatives, or they're only introducing it now in 2020. Few had disability initiatives, visible or invisible, except through benefits and or for students. But by and large, this is still a gap, a persistent gap. And the fourth point I want to make then is most of the changes we've seen around Indigenous peoples in universities, colleges, and CGFs have come via the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not employment equity per se, not EDI per se. So I want to differentiate to employment equity and EDI. The weight of employment equity is it's rooted in human rights and equality struggles. That not only the Abella report and the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment, or the Employment Equity Act, or Section 15 of the Charter, which calls for special measures. employment equity has that backdrop to it. EDI does not. What equity, diversity, inclusion is voluntary, ad hoc. It's can be seen as a luxury for good times. What it does add, though, that employment equity didn't add, is that it allows us to engage with students. So whereas employment equity focused primarily on faculty and staff of the university, employees or employment, so to speak, EDI does extend to students, undergraduate and graduate and postdoc, and talks about the student experience, curriculum, and other kinds of areas. So that's key. So the other point I want to make then is that we have to be mindful of, and I think this points have been raised, so I don't want to go over them too long, is that under the federal contractors program, I still think that the strength of those programs, ironically, what was argued for still persists and actually shape what's happening in Canadian universities, where it is happening. So for example, the federal contractors program called for 12 things, right? One is adopt accountability mechanisms, and we know that they don't exist. Assign a senior official. Universities are now hiring people like me, or assistant deans, EDI, only now. Communicate to employees. Most universities, it's top down rather than requiring students, faculty, and staff or the stakeholders to be participating in them. So this actually, that's a weaker accountability mechanism today than I thought was called for earlier. Collect workforce data. Universities have gender data, but not necessarily through EDI. It's because it's on all the forms that we have in universities and also through the UCAS system. There is no comparable data for visible/racialized minorities, indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities or LGBTQ. So there's a patchwork of uneven data collection, which we must stress. Few are doing workforce analyses. Few will be able to tell you the barriers and biases that face universities, face each of the equity seeking group. In fact, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And so if you're not identifying the barriers and biases, that means you are unable to talk about removing those barriers. And so I would argue that the initiatives we are seeing in the aftermath of the anti-racism mobilization, the policies and processes, these are, I would say, as bold as some of them look, they're still ad hoc because they're not necessarily informed by a workforce data analysis. So we don't know whether they will actually address the nature of the problem, the systemic problems. And we don't know what monitoring system exists. So this back to Carol's point that any renovation of the Employment Equity Act must have stronger accountability mechanism. The third point I want to make, again, very briefly, is with the changes in the federal contractors program between 2010, 2012, and 2012, and then 2017, and then under the Harper government. So what we had in that scenario was that we had still a very small percentage of universities, colleges, CJEPs that were subjected to the federal contractors program, something like 59, 60 of them. Most of the U15 universities were subject to them. After the changes brought in by the Harper government that's been already addressed, only about 5 U15 were subject to the thing, and I think now most aren't. In other words, most universities that are engaged in EDI are doing so in a voluntary basis, and there's actually no accountability mechanism left. Okay, so so paradoxically though, where universities are dealing with EDI in a more robust mechanism approach, they are doing it through the research ecosystem. That is the federal contractors program. Sorry, that is the tri-agencies, the Canada Research Chairs and the Dimensions EDI strategy. And they are calling for exactly the same kind of mechanisms that the federal contractors program called for, but they have actually stronger mechanisms. So including the push for disaggregated data. They are in fact sharing data on student awards, on research chairs, and so on, including master's and PhD data. So the final point that I want to make is I think there are 5 or 6 things that we need to do in order to strengthen the current Modernization of Employment Equity Act. One is we need to change the language. Many universities are already dealing with LGBTQ as corporations, and so this needs to be updated. Secondly, while I hear that people say we need to renovate the language of visible racialized minorities, I am reticent about that, and I have said so to StatsCan people, because it's actually rooted in legislation, right? And there's a whole kind of genealogy that you can attach to that. But I think the data needs to be disaggregated by Black, South Asians, Chinese, Filipinos who racialize. Thirdly, we need to change the Indigenous, but also focus on First Nations, Métis, Inuit, again, disaggregated, and we need to do gender identity and gender expression. So yes, that nuances and intersections, but StatsCan's already doing this as well. The third thing that I think we need, and again, in this disaggregated data, is we need accountability mechanisms. There needs to be consequences for universities who do not comply. So what I would suggest is, I know Carol pointed out, say we should have $50 as the funding basis for those universities. I would say that any university that gets research funding, undergraduate, graduate, master's, PhD, should have to have an equity plan. Any funding at any level should be part of it, not just contracts. And then finally, as I said, there needs to be consequences, which just means, and I would say strong consequences, which something like you're not eligible to apply for any of this funding without a robust employment equity plan with accountability mechanisms. And again, so I'm happy again to talk more about the disaggregated data, because the data clearly shows, including Universities Canada data, COUT underrepresented and underpaid data, show that we have far to go for meeting equitable representation. That's the flaw in Canadian universities. Thanks.
Thank you, Malinda, for raising some really important strategies for change. And I must say, and thank you all actually, for nicely non-overlapping but reinforcing presentations. We certainly have seen some important ways forward. That's one of the consistent questions that's been coming up in the chat, is questions around movements, social movements, and all of you have raised these to some extent, unions and other social movements. How can they work together to achieve this, to be intersectional in their own processes in terms of moving forward? That's one of the questions we had. Does anyone want to take that up? Malinda?
So thanks. I strongly believe that any movement we have had on equity in Canadian universities and colleges has been a result of community mobilization. I said, I credit the women's movement for any gains, including with women's studies programs and so on. If you think about the LGBTQ movement, that was pushing also external to university, that was mobilizing change around representation, around gay, straight alliances, around these kinds of things, independent of what was happening in universities. And they continue to be supported by external actors. And in fact, then similarly around the recent anti-racism movements, which have spurred changes for anti-Black racism initiatives, or the TRC and I don't know more that spurred changes for indigenization. So my view is an intersectional sort of kind of a social movement is vital, indispensable to actually maintaining the pressure on universities who are reluctant internally, it seems, to mobilize around advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion. So yes, social movements are vital.
Thank you, Malinda. Carol, have you something you want to say about this question of social movements and other organizations outside the university that can contribute to the changes you were advocating? but you'll need to unmute yourself. Carol, we can't hear you. You need to.
Thank you. I better unmute myself. Yeah, I think we have employment equity at all because of the activism of social movements. And I think Abella recognized that at the time that she wrote her report. I think at this stage where we are today, social movements are critical to getting the changes that we want in the Federal Employment Equity Act, but they also are really important as a possible vehicle for us to get provincial level employment equity, which is so badly needed. As it is, the Federal Employment Equity Act only covers a small proportion, say somewhere around 10 to 12% of the workforce of Canada. And most people that work are covered by provincial employment regulations and legislation. So at the provincial level, groups like Color of Change have advocated that we work together on getting employment equity legislation for Ontario or for other provinces. And I think if we could possibly mobilize people at the provincial level toward that end, we would really accomplish something major for change.
Larry?
Yes, I believe the provincial aspect is the greater challenge. It is the great frontier. But then again, the mobilization is to bring it to the fore, whether it's at Queen's Park or any of the other legislatures, to make sure that not only are we mobilizing, but we are bringing the data as well to the fore, to the attention of our politicians, so that it becomes very apparent how they have so much to make up for in this field. So we're not going to get anywhere if we don't have behind us a solid movement that represents all the intersectionalities that we're talking about. And it is through the recognition of all these intersectionalities that we will get that solidarity where everyone will say yes at every level, whether it's federal, whether it's provincial, or whether it's municipal, everywhere where employment is concerned, we need to have these policies and we need to have accountability and responsibility at the same time.
Thank you. There are two other questions. One of them raised by, in fact, much of what you said, Larry, about who is missing from the legislation. Like, should this be extended beyond LGBTQ to family status, age? I wonder if, and that's been raised in the questions, I wonder if Carol and Malinda would like to comment on that. Perhaps we'll go with you first, Malinda.
There's a lot of push in this direction to use the Human Rights Code list of things that and I am inclined to differentiate between human rights legislation, the broad list of enumerated grounds, and then employment equity. And I believe that the human rights aspect are already protected. And that what Abella did was look at those human rights grounds and say, among these groups, here are the 5 that are facing systemic and sustained and self-perpetuating discrimination. I don't think that has changed. I think in universities, for example, we have addressed age somewhat because, you know, removing mandatory retirement and also, but so that's not quite what I see there. And I think different family forms are also being taken up in terms of benefit packages. Where I do see some space requirements for shift is around the precarious workers. And so that's, the question is, how do we incorporate that group of faculty, the teaching professoriate into the agreement? But no, I would say most university statements already say the 5 equity seeking groups, including but not limited to. Thanks.
Okay, Thank you. It's interesting that you raised the precarious faculty members, because that was one of the questions that was raised as well in the chat. Carol, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I guess my sense right now is that the Employment Equity Act is not a piece of legislation that can change the world. And if we put that on it, we probably are not going to end up with the results that we're looking for the groups, as Malinda said, that have been most discriminated against in the workplace. I think we need to reinforce our commitment to employment equity for those groups, plus the LGBTQ population, which has not previously been covered, mainly because the data to make a case for that has more recently been provided and to decision makers. I think we need to look at other means of addressing the needs of older workers, vulnerable workers of all kinds. And we have to remember too that the human rights system has been quite vigorous in pursuing complaints of discrimination, and at times making employers do things differently as part of a settlement in a case of discrimination. So that's another route that we have available to us, and so I would reinforce Malinda's suggestion that the human rights process remains important to address these issues.
Thank you. And Larry, when you were talking about who is missing, I was also wondering about what employers are missing. Carol and Malinda have talked about the contractors program, but are there other employers that are missing from this legislation?
Are you talking about the federal level or just generally?
Generally, well, both.
Yes, certainly. You know, it begs the question: why shouldn't all employers be subjected to it? I mean, why should we have just one category of employers? I mean, if we're really going to give, you know, credence and weight to the principles of employment equity, then as soon as you are working in the field of personnel, and I hate the term human resources because I hated it in the 1980s and 90s when all of a sudden personnel became human resources. We're not a bunch of assets that you're extracting and making profits on, although that's the way many, many employers see it. But I want to say that if we do apply the principles of employment equity, then why should anybody be left out?
Right.
I guess that was exactly my point in advocating for something to be done at the provincial level, because in our federal system, there's the federal domain jurisdiction for employment and there's the provincial jurisdiction for employment. And whoever isn't working in the federal jurisdiction is working in the provincial jurisdiction. So we can't have more employers covered under federal law than exist in the federal jurisdiction. So if we want more employers covered, we have to have legislation at the provincial level, which is an awkward fact of the Canadian system, but it is a fact.
It also doesn't allow for the kind of loopholes where you see people say, well, you know what, we're going to incorporate provincially so that we don't have to be subject to the federal requirements. And that's something that we see a lot of as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is why I think any institution, college, university, CJEP, otherwise, that gets any federal research funding, my view is if they had to have an employment equity plan that would cover all of them. And because then you don't get into this federal provincial education is a provincial dilemma, but also in terms of data collection, we have to attend to the ways in which the human rights commissions have also been weakened in some places, where they have different requirements around data collection. Race-based data, for example, are prevented in some. So some universities kind of wiggle around collecting data using that mechanism. So there needs to be another mechanism other than the provincial, though, to enable universities, colleges, and CGEPs to be compliant.
Thank you. And perhaps I'll give you each a last word. We are running out of time. I'm sure we could go on, especially when we have lots of comments and questions that to continue. But we'll start with Larry. Your final words, Larry, but for us to hear your words, we've got, yes.
Okay, so yes, thank you. I'm thinking just to pick up on the last couple of points that we were talking about, expanding, employment equity to cover the groups that are not named. I think that once again, if we apply the principles that are involved, we're going to catch a lot of the rest. Because the principles, we're trying to remove the barriers, especially the systemic barriers that exist. We're also trying to get rid of those ceilings. And when we have a culture in employment that immediately reacts to say, what is equality here? How are we going to achieve it? Then we will be asking the questions about ageism. We will be asking the questions about precariousness. We will be asking all those questions to make sure that nobody gets left behind.
Thanks, Larry. Carol.
Yeah, I would agree with Larry on those points. And I guess just that at this point, we have an opportunity to influence the federal government to recognize the value of a renewed Employment Equity Act that could then be a model for other equity transformation initiatives after that. So let's make the Employment Equity Act once again the landmark leading piece of legislation that it was considered back in 1986 when it first came on board, and countries in Europe and Australia and New Zealand and others were looking to Canada for leadership on this particularly important issue. And I don't think they're looking to us anymore. So we need to up our game and make ourselves leaders in working toward equity.
Thank you, Carol. Malinda?
Thanks. I think we need to hold university bodies accountable. And I think we need to do that through institutions like Universities Canada. I know COUT's doing its work. And I think Universities Canada needs to be, it's the University of Presidents. I know that the 2019 survey, only 60% of presidents responded to it. So I think that's important. I want to give a shout out to the granting agencies, actually, because I think equity has been sustained and mobilized precisely because they've been pushing it. And I want to give a shout out to the 8 women who launched that human rights case around the CRC. Yeah. People like, Audrey Kobayashi, people like, the late Wendy Robbins and others who did that. That was actually really, really important. But I again think, it's the activism of those 8 women that have energized employment equity. We're even talking about it in universities today because of that kind of push. So kudos to the granting agencies and to the 8 women, famous 8.
And kudos to all 3 of you for excellent presentations too. I would say, I heard you say that the commissions were important, that the legislation is important, but none of them would have been possible without social action and pressure from social movements, and not just in getting the legislation, but getting the legislation applied. And in order to do that, we need data that actually gets at what we want to get at, and we need enforcement mechanisms that are tough and clear. I hope I am not misrepresenting anybody, but that would be my summary of the many, many things that we heard. And thank you all for an excellent presentation. And I will remind people that this session has been recorded and will be made available by the CAUT. And thank you all for joining us, and especially for our interpreters and for on various levels, a hard job it is. Thank you all. Bye.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.